Welcome, everyone. I am Bob Wurzelbacher, Director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and this is our video podcast series that we call Being Pro-Life. Each month, we discuss a different topic in the Respect Life arena. We'll hear a personal story from someone deeply involved with that issue, and finally, we'll share ways that you can get involved. This month's topic is on the drug crisis in our communities, and today, as always, we have a special guest. Will you please introduce yourself?
Hi, Bob. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Amanda Conn Starner. I'm one of the Senior Directors at PreventionFIRST. PreventionFIRST is a local nonprofit in the greater Cincinnati area that's been around for about 25 years. And our focus is on substance abuse prevention across the lifespan, but with a particular focus on youth substance use prevention as well as mental wellness.
All right, so Amanda, thanks for being on the show. So we're kicking off this month's topic on drug addiction with a focus on prevention. That's probably a great way to do it. But let's begin by asking, there's a lot of stigma around drug addiction. People make a lot of presumptions on, if you will, the kind of person that is going to be addicted to drugs. So let's break into a lot of that, right? So what can you tell us about the science of drug addiction that might help people have a better understanding of how this happens?
Sure thing. Thank you, Bob. I would say one of the best resources I think out there, if folks want to follow up with this podcast, is the National Institute of Drug Abuse. They have some great materials that are free, and they give a very good layout of exactly how the science of addiction works. So from that website, we gain a lot of our knowledge about the science of addiction. I think folks don't understand that the age of when a brain fully develops for an adult is the age of 25. So if we can delay that onset of first use by youth about substances so that their brain isn't altered with chemicals from substances, it's all the more the better, not only for the individual, but for families and for the community, because they're leading more productive lives and they're having a healthier outcome overall. So the age of first use, 25, the prefrontal cortex of the brain is the last to develop. So that's the area of judgment and cognitive thinking. So that is what we want to be mindful of. There's a reason why car rental companies pick that age of 25 to begin having people actually rent cars, because that is a key development year for the brain development. So that is a focus of what NIDA talks about with the science of addiction. What we're finding, though, is the age of first use, though, for most youth, especially in this area, is 13. And that's from our Pride Student Drug Use Survey that we carry out every 2 years. We survey a number of students, tens of thousands in the greater Cincinnati area, and the average age of first use is 13. If you look nationally, the age of first use is around 14. If you look at data from Monitoring the Future, which is a very long-term study that's been happening for decades around the country, they have found that age of first use is 14.
So 13 and 14. Do you want to say something else first, or can I ask you, how is it? Is there even a typical way that a 13, 14-year-old gets started on some kind of drug?
Sure. Generally, what we found that the substances that they're initially trying in this last survey cycle, vaping surpassed alcohol. Now, for years, alcohol was the drug of choice, first choice for substances by youth at the age of 13. And that's, again, this is average. Not everyone starts at the age of 13. So vaping surpassed alcohol in terms of substances used. So in the last survey cycle, we found vaping, alcohol, marijuana are the top substances used by 13, or that 7th and 8th grade.
Is this typically because kids are out doing something and parents don't know, they're at a party somewhere, or parents don't care? What do we know?
It's a great question. It's a combination of home and family. And the environment. So are there good boundaries being put by family members? Is there constructive use of time by youth? Do they have solid protective factors? For example, church is a protective factor. Being involved in a hobby or event or sports that you have a great appreciation for and you want to succeed in. Those are all protective factors. The more you have those versus risk factors, the likelihood of individuals wanting to try or start dabbling in substances and going down a path of full addiction is going to be minimized. So it's a combination of home, family, and the environment. So communities, are there lots of festivals where vaping is present? Is alcohol prevalent in every single community event? Are adults around the children at home and in the family, are they using alcohol prevalently throughout? And kids are getting the signal that it's okay, like to have fun, you need alcohol or vaping or some other substance to ease and have a good time. So it's a community effort too, as well.
Right. Basically, if the parents, if every night they're sitting in front of the TV, having a beer, right? Or if every time you go to a party, there's so much alcohol around, the assumption is that you got to have alcohol in order to have fun, that kind of thing. Versus if you can see that when there's a gathering, many of the adults might have a beer, but there might just be one, right?
Right.
Is there an obvious distinction, or if the kids just see it, they're going to assume I want to start that as early as possible? Is there any?
It's definitely that you're setting up a social norm,
right.
That the adults may not know and realize, but if the kid's always going to an event or a church festival or something like that, where there's constantly alcohol and there's no control over that, and the adults are getting maybe too much alcohol, there's no control with how many beverages are limited, it's going to show up either like in the behavior of the parents, or it might get out of hand. There might be some public safety issues. It changes the dynamic of how kids see. They see that, oh, I guess you need some kind of alcohol or beverage to have fun. There's plenty of ways to have events. For example, mocktails, where you don't have alcohol, but you have like fruity non-alcoholic drinks and no one's really getting out of hand. And also, I know you've done work with the recovery community. Being mindful of people who are in recovery and not having that alcohol present at every single event is a benefit as well for the recovery community.
Right.
Addiction is universal. I don't want folks to come away thinking that it only happens in areas that are impoverished. It is across the board. Affluent communities, rural communities, urban communities, every kind of community has addiction. It's just how a community addresses it with prevention measures, interventions. And on that note, I would add that Prevention First has 35 member coalitions that are grassroots groups that people can get involved in if they'd like to volunteer and they have a passion for this, for prevention, treatment, and recovery. There are grassroots coalitions throughout the greater Cincinnati area in the urban, suburban, and rural areas where people can get involved, and they carry out doing great work around substance use prevention and mental wellness for kids. We focus on suicide prevention as that connects to substance use. We focus on mental wellness, keeping kids away from drugs and alcohol. So there's a plethora of different coalitions in the area that if folks really would like to get involved, we have those available.
Right. We'll definitely talk about involvement a little bit later on in this podcast. So vaping, so you have to be 21. How is it? What is there a typical way that, like, for example, if you're a kid and you're younger and you can't get vaping products by yourself, but somebody has to get them for you, I could see why maybe there's a party and somebody brings it or something like that and parents don't know about it. But how would you then continue to get that product and get addicted to that product as a child?
Well, I think it's a combination. I've gone to different schools and I've heard kids blatantly say that they've gotten it from their parents. Their parents
Right.
order it for them because they feel that it's going to help them with anxiety. And that's just the polar opposite. Vaping is just as dangerous as cigarette use. Vaping, comes from the same tobacco companies that brought us the cigarettes. And really just vaping and juuling is the terminology used by the cigarette companies to sell really what are e-cigarettes. So the dangers are still there for youth and anyone who uses vaping around the tobacco use of nicotine. So it's very popular with the youth. The flavors are there. They're created there to entice the kids to use. There's bubblegum, cherry, you name it. There's every kind of flavor for vaping.
So is it the same amount of nicotine that is in a
just
cigarette?
about. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Similar. Okay.
Yeah.
So it creates the same habit forming kind of situation.
Yeah.
I understand it's not as dangerous in terms of like the tar buildup in your lungs kind of thing. Is that correct?
It still has the effects on the lungs, and they're still studying that extensively. But what's unfortunate is there's not a lot of tobacco cessation programs for youth. And so, if they get started on that, 9 times out of 10, they're also going for another substance as well. So they're getting used to that. I'm getting stressed. I'm getting anxiety. I got to turn to something to ease.
Okay, sure. Building up a pattern that looks for something. some kind of a substance to help you with stress and nerves and such, which is not a good combination, right? Okay. So you were saying, so part of it is poor education, I suppose, meaning people don't understand that they're giving it to their kids because they obviously don't think there's anything dangerous about it. They obviously don't think that.
And I think it's just, it's not, it kind of, it really exploded on the scene several years ago. And we went from cigarettes are bad. And there's still that stigma now with kids. They think cigarettes are bad. And now this vaping and juuling is seen as cool. So we suddenly shifted very quickly. And, we had to catch up as a field. Parents had to catch up about what's happening and how their kids were being targeted with these flavors. So it's coming around. The CDC has a very good website and information on this if folks would like more information. But just know that it's a substance and it's very popular with kids, and it's going to lead to problems down the road around because it is cigarette use.
Okay, so can we get a little bit more into how is it a young person might just become addicted to substances almost, outside of their parents' awareness until they're pretty far down the road? How might that typically happen today?
So it's a combination of biology. If there is a gene addiction in your family, that's something that kids need to know. If there's mental disorders in the family, that also sets you up for a predisposition to substance use disorders. So it's a combination of biology, what's in your family tree, and then environmental factors. So how is the home and family life? What are your peers in school situation? What protective factors are there in place to help kids not go down that path? And I mentioned a little bit of those earlier about hobbies, church, different things they can feel a self-empowerment with and a sense of community. They got to have that sense and connection to a community. So if you have kids who are not in tune with resiliency skills or refusal skills when it comes to substances, and they feel that they have to turn to a substance to ease anxiety or stress, and they don't have the good coping skills in mind, then they're going to turn to substances. It's very widely available, fairly inexpensive to get, and they see other peers doing it. So in some ways, some kids will try around age 13, 14 with substances. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to go down a huge path of addiction, but you want to stop that and be mindful that your brain is not fully developed till 25. You need to not alter that brain development, those brain cells, so that you can make healthy choices, continue on a path of productivity. But some kids, they do get wrapped up into starting. They might start with vaping, they might start with alcohol, and maybe they're not getting that high that they wanted or that fix that they wanted, and they might start turning to substances as well. But then on the flip side, as I believe you alluded to earlier with the opioid epidemic and our addiction epidemic, opioids, in some cases, there are many youth who maybe they were athletes. They had to have a couple of surgeries. They were given some oxycodone or other types of prescription drugs that are opioid based. And maybe that wasn't what they were supposed to have, or their body just, it led them down to a path of dependence. There's many stories about athletes who've gone in for surgery and then end up getting addicted to opioids and then eventually full-blown heroin addiction because that opioid with the prescription wasn't available to them, or it wasn't giving them the fix that they wanted, and they went to heroin. So we have an initiative that we work with called Non-Opioid Choices Initiative, and we're trying to work with the medical community and legislators to make people aware that there are other choices that are not opioid based that can help with pain management post-surgery. For example, acupuncture, massage therapy, physical therapy, cognitive therapy, all those type of things that don't involve opioids and don't set people up for using a path of dependence for opioids.
Right. That's certainly been a big topic. I'm sure there's people who have perfectly good reason to be on opioids for a short amount of time. You just have to be careful not to take too much for too long. But absolutely, if there are other ways that are more natural, and that's certainly the way to go. We were talking about, kids starting with alcohol or vaping and moving on to harder substances. How would they get a hold of heroin? For example, is it much more common than I realize? Is it easier to get heroin these days?
Yeah, it usually is a pattern of usually later in life, maybe in the 20s, 30s, when they're starting to use that because maybe they've exhausted trying to go down the prescription drug route and they're not getting the opioids that they wanted that were giving them the high that they wanted. So in some cases, they do turn to heroin, and it is fairly readily available if they get to know who they need to find it from. So
It sounds like maybe you're suggesting that it's fairly typical that if a person starts on something that's more easily available, like alcohol or vaping as a younger child, that's going to affect their brain chemistry so that as an adult, they stop getting the high and the stress coping that they need with things that are more readily available like that. And then they start turning to even harder things down the road. You're not talking about a 13-year-old turning to heroin by 14. Not that, I mean, that happens, I'm sure, as well. But you're suggesting that, man, if they start on something simple at 13 and 14, I guess, if you will, the odds of them eventually over time needing to turn to something stronger and stronger as they get older is probably greater than if they hadn't started on that.
Correct. Or you even get people who start in alcohol, maybe alcohol is their drug of choice, and they become fully addicted to alcohol well into their middle age. They didn't go to anything stronger, street drugs, but they definitely have an issue with alcohol. Same thing with marijuana. Maybe there's people who started in high school, college with marijuana, and they feel it gives them their coping skill. Ultimately, all these substances are not doing anything for anyone. It's a public safety issue. It's a public health issue. It's an individual issue within the family, within that person, within the community. Ultimately, we have to teach coping skills that don't involve substances. We have to be mindful of post-surgery. What other options are there? Not saying that you can't have a small prescription of medicine, but being mindful that's not going to be your end game to deal with the pain. There's got to be other ways you can try to have pain management under control. So it's all about not having the substances to turn to cope with life, really.
Right, exactly. Are there stats you have that help people understand it's not just the inner city? This also affects the suburbs. It's not just the poor. This also affects the middle class, the upper class, right? It doesn't just happen in really poor schools. This happens in wealthy schools as well, things like that.
Absolutely. I've been here at Prevention First for 10 years, and I've overseen the coalitions that we have. And I have seen them in very affluent communities in the greater Cincinnati area. I've seen them in impoverished areas. I've seen them in middle class. I've seen them in rural. Addiction is universal. The affluent are just as susceptible to it as those who don't have the economic means. If anything, when you think about it, the affluent have access more because the youth have the cars, the youth have the money, they have access within their home to get those substances. So I think that's a misperception around affluent folks not using. I mean, the access is there. Ultimately, it's universal, and prevention is universal then. We're trying to just put out good skills and good curriculums and good community level change groups like coalitions to let people know, it takes a village to make sure that we're setting a healthy environment in the home, the workplace, and the community around how substances are seen.
So you're all about prevention. Okay. So what do you do, and how is it that we can stop getting kids and adults and anyone, right, involved in being addicted with some kind of substance in the first place?
Sure. If this is something that individuals would be interested in, I would encourage them to look at our website, and we have 35 member coalitions. So what does that mean? That means there's 35 grassroots organizations in the greater Cincinnati area across all geographic types of neighborhoods that are solely focused. They're volunteer based. I mean, these people are passionate about making a difference in the lives of youth as well as the community. We have them in Norwood. We have them in Terrace Park. We have them in Batesville, Indiana. We have them in Northern Kentucky. They're all over. And these are committed individuals who take a focus on helping schools put prevention measures. We have curriculums that are very focused on teaching coping skills early on. We also work with the law enforcement. We work with legislators. We work with colleges as well. So there's always a place that, at least in the greater Cincinnati area, that I think if folks wanted to get involved and just kind of learn about it or volunteer, they always need help with grant writing skills, graphic design, websites, press releases, getting the word out, take back events. I don't know how many of your viewers or listeners have participated in National Take Back Days, but that's where twice a year the DEA hosts take back events so that we're mindful of getting out of our medicine cabinets prescription drugs that they're not being used, they're expired, they need to just get out of the home. And that way it prevents theft and misuse of those prescription drugs as well.
Okay, so you brought up your website. Why don't we take a moment and show that on the screen? All right, so that is found at prevention-first.org. If you're listening on the podcast, prevention-first.org, or you can see it on the screen if you're watching the video. Tell us what we can find here on your website.
First thing that comes to mind as I'm looking at the Training Hub tab, we have a number of free webinars that we put on for the greater Cincinnati community. And there's a host of different free webinars that you can check out if you want to learn more about prevention. Here's one right now, trauma-informed care with youth. Cultural competency. We also have one coming up on how the National Guard is a coalition resource. And then we have an archive as well of the different ones that we've done in the past.
Yeah, so these are just free. You just sign up for these?
Absolutely. No, the ones that are already up there, they're recorded, generally about an hour. Some of them might be about an hour and a half. But we had one just recently on suicide prevention among youth. And that is a big factor that we're working in the communities with and with schools. This one was just held recently called Screen Time and Health Outcomes, and how youth are using gaming, gambling, how they're doing that and how that relates to their health. So all free, I shouldn't say free, no cost to you.
I understand the distinction. It is not free, but it is free for you.
Right. And that's because we have state funding from the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So they are one of our key agencies that we work with a lot.
Wow, that is great. What else can we do? So you get some great free for the participant virtual trainings. That's terrific. What else you want to tell us about this?
So we have a student drug. You'll see here our data-driven decision-making. Everything that we do is data-driven. We carry out a student survey every 2 years. I mentioned it earlier. We have probably around 60,000 kids participate in the Cincinnati area. And they take this online survey, and that's what gives us the data that shows the age of first use, 30-day use by youth, how parents are influencing them, how peers are influencing them. So that is a survey. Actually, if you're in a school district, the registration is open right now. So if there's a school that would be interested in the Cincinnati area for taking that survey, we can provide some funding to help with the school for that. And that is open right now, but it gives a great assessment tool for schools and communities to see, what substances are being used by youth, what are the issues around this, so that, schools and staff can create strategies to try to reduce those rates. So that's one thing you see right there. There's our mission and our vision. So we have a newsletter there.
E-newsletter sign up.
Yep.
How can the regular person in the pew get involved?
Obviously, that getting an awareness of prevention, I don't think folks understand that it's an actual discipline. I'm credentialed in Ohio to carry out prevention. There is an actual discipline to it, and there's a field to it. So that is one way just to get an awareness. It's beyond a DARE curriculum or anything like that I think people are used to hearing, especially going back as far as the 1980s, DARE and just say no. It's deeper than that. People can get involved by making sure that there's good curriculums, that their kids are being taught in a health class. A health class is a good way to be able to teach some substance use prevention, and making sure that that's in the schools, that there's good protective factors. Is there stuff that kids can get involved in? They get bored. They're bored. So what do you turn to? They usually turn to substances because they're bored. But making sure there's good, solid activities that are in a community for youth. There's so many coalitions we work with that there's just nothing for the kids to do, especially in the rural areas. And to have that good, healthy outlet where they can go maybe to a YMCA or to some kind of event that doesn't have the vaping, doesn't have the alcohol, and it just has good, clean fun, if you will, to build their self-esteem and to keep them away from using substances and being in an environment that is conducive to that. So that is one way, making sure that there's just good events in your community. Getting involved and knowing more about exactly what addiction is and how you can be a part of it. I mentioned NIDA earlier, the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Our website will connect you with the coalitions and just prevention as well. So I think just being an awareness of being a protective factor in a youth's life. So whether you're a caregiver or a parent, you're setting good boundaries for the youth. You're giving them a constructive use of time. You're talking with them about substances. Don't be afraid to not have that talk. that's where, dangers can lie, because they're going to go to people who will talk to them about it. And that's not who you're going to want them to talk to. So having that good dialogue, that good communication tool with them as well.
Now, I'm going to say probably every parent would like to believe that if their kid is showing some dangers, that they're getting involved in some kind of drug abuse, they would be able to tell and they would notice what's not going to happen to their kid, right? So what would be signs that we'd be looking for, like that maybe not every parent notices?
Mm-hmm. A great question. I would say, being mindful of their behaviors. Have they suddenly withdrawn? Are they showing drastic mood swings? Are, they having physical signs of bloodshot eyes? Does their physical demeanor look different in terms of possibly using? That's not necessarily they may not be using, but just those type of things coupled with, are they suddenly not doing well in school? Or are they suddenly with a new group of friends that they never were a part before? I would also, be mindful of looking around in the room, look through the items that they have to see if there's anything that they're hiding. We have a actual traveling exhibit that a lot of coalitions use called Hidden in Plain Sight. And it's usually held by law enforcement. And what they'll do is they will take a mock bedroom and they will show different paraphernalia that can be hidden in a child's room, and how parents can look for that and see if they're actually trying. And folks can look that up as well. It's Hidden in Plain Sight. So there are virtual trainings that you can take through that, like adults can go and watch one now. But I think just solid communication too, having that talk and say, reaching that youth and saying, what's going on? I'm seeing patterns that aren't like you, and getting that dialogue going so that they know that they have a trusted person to turn to, their parent or caregiver or whomever, so that they can start that conversation. Just because a kid is used doesn't mean they're going down a full path of addiction, but you want to get that dialogue, stop it in its tracks, and get them on a good path back to not using. If folks feel that they're down a deeper path of dependence, there are treatment facilities just for youth in the greater Cincinnati area and around the country. I would recommend going to the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services website. They have a list by county, all the treatment facilities that are available for adults and youth, what kind of insurance is taken, and where they're located. So an assessment needs to be done by a trained professional, a treatment professional, about whether a youth does have a dependence, or it's either abuse, dependence, or full-blown addiction. So that's not in my wheelhouse, but there are number of treatment professionals around this area that can help parents.
What was that website you mentioned again? The Ohio Department?
Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services.
Okay. You go to that website and you can find something in your area if you need to find that for yourself or your child.
Yes.
I suppose. Right.
And I will add another one. So if for some reason the viewers are out of Ohio, you can go to SAMHSA, has a national log of all the treatment providers. So that is SAMHSA, SAMHSA, and that stands for Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. They're the big federal agency that provides a lot of funding for the work that treatment, recovery, and prevention do.
So SAMHSA with an H in the middle for mental health. Amanda, anything else you wanted to add about how churches or something could get involved with?
Absolutely. So there's a number of sectors that help carry out prevention in a community, and faith is a big one. We actually have a toolkit called Building Prevention with Faith, and we have a training that accompanies that. And there is funding available right now for any church or organization in Ohio that wants to get this toolkit and the training. The goal of it is to start growing prevention in a faith sector, so in a church setting. So we can work with churches to help them build prevention among their congregation, put in strategies, different activities, different programs, and get the talk going around prevention. Churches and faith have historically done a great job of working with the AA community, the NA community, Al-Anon, Alateen, with providing space for those meetings and a safe place for congregation members to go. But we want to also make sure that prevention can be talked about in the congregation. And we also have funding to do about a 2-hour training to help you implement it.
So we can get information on that at preventionfirst.org, right?
Correct, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, terrific, great. All right. Well, thanks so much, Amanda, for sharing with us today about how kids might typically get started on substance abuse issues and how it is that your work and helping with prevention in our communities and how it is that we can all get involved, including as a church community as well. So thanks for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Bob.
And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in on this episode of our Being Pro-Life series. Head to the website and check out the video version or the links talked about in this episode at www.catholicaoc.org/beingprolife. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to being with you next time.